There are moments in sports that don't make the highlight reel. Moments that happen in the quiet spaces before the opening tip, in the hallways of an arena, in a press box where a reporter types a story he knows is true and hits publish anyway. This is one of those moments. And the reason you probably haven't heard the full version of it isn't because the story is small. It's because the people with the power to shape the narrative decided, very deliberately, that you shouldn't. May 20th, Gainbridge Fieldhouse, Indianapolis. 90 minutes before tip-off, and Caitlin Clark's name quietly disappears from the active roster. Not in the morning, not at the league-mandated 5 o'clock deadline when every team is required to file an injury report. 90 minutes before the game, in a building already packed with 17,000 people who bought their tickets weeks in advance, who made travel plans, who showed up early, who were already in their seats with their popcorn and their jerseys and their phones out to film the moment she walked through the tunnel. None of them were told why. None of them got an explanation. They just looked up at the board and her name wasn't there. That right there should have been the story. A superstar scratched with no warning, no transparency, no acknowledgement that tens of thousands of people deserved even a basic explanation. But it didn't stop there. Because one man decided to do his job and tell you what actually happened that night. And what the Indiana Fever did to him for it is the kind of thing that should make every single person who follows this sport genuinely angry. His name is Scott Agness, and 2 weeks after he filed that report, the organization pulled his credential. 12 years of covering this franchise, gone. Not because he got something wrong, not because he fabricated a source, because he told you the truth about Caitlin Clark's body, and the front office didn't want that particular truth floating around in public. That's where this story starts, and it goes a lot deeper than one reporter losing a press pass. Let's talk about who Scott Agnes actually is, because the organization is counting on you not knowing. They're counting on you hearing reporter loses credential and shrugging it off as some internal media politics thing that doesn't affect you. But once you understand who this man is and what he built over 12 years, the decision to strip him of access stops looking like a minor administrative dispute and starts looking like exactly what it is. Agnes has been covering the Indiana Fever and the Pacers since 2013, 12 years. That's longer than any other journalist walking through the doors of Gainbridge Fieldhouse. He was there before the current roster was assembled, before the coaching staff was hired, before Caitlin Clark was even a household name outside of college basketball. He attended every training camp practice, every home game. He didn't treat this like a beat he was assigned and tolerated. He treated it like a responsibility he took seriously enough to fund himself. Here's the detail that hits different when you really sit with it. Agnes paid out of his own pocket to bring a photographer to games, not expensed it to some media company, paid for it himself, because he believed the coverage deserved better than a reporter showing up with a phone camera. He invested his own money into making the product better for the people reading it. That's not the behavior of a man trying to stir up trouble. That's the behavior of someone who genuinely cares about doing this right. The numbers back up everything he built. In the last year alone, his work pulled more than 7 million views, readers in 49 states, 83 countries. People all over the world tuning in to read his coverage of an Indiana basketball team because he'd built enough trust over a decade plus that they knew when he wrote something, it was worth reading. 7 million views, 49 states, 83 countries, and the organization he poured all of that into just locked the door behind him. So when people in the comments sections ask why him, that's the answer. They didn't go after a blogger with a grudge. They didn't go after some anonymous account throwing accusations from behind a keyboard. They went after the most credentialed, most experienced, most loyal voice in the building. And the only reason you burn someone like that is because they know enough to hurt you.
Now here's the part where the timeline starts to matter, because the timeline is everything. Go back to May 20th and walk through exactly what happened hour by hour, because when you lay it out like that, the Fever's decision to punish Agnes stops making any sense at all unless you understand what they were actually trying to protect. The Fever were playing their 4th game in 8 days. That matters. That kind of schedule grinds on bodies even when players are fully healthy. And when a player's managing something, 4 games in 8 days is when it shows up. Caitlin Clark was averaging nearly 31 minutes per game at that point, and between runs, she was sitting on the bench with a heating pad pressed against her back. Not an ice bag, a heating pad. The kind of treatment you use when something is stiff, tight, or inflamed. The kind of treatment you don't need if your back is completely fine. The league rule is clear. Every team files an injury report by 5 o'clock. Clark's name wasn't on it. Not that morning, not that afternoon, not at the deadline. The report came and went, and she was listed as available. And then, 90 minutes before tip, the scratch came. 90 minutes. The building was already full. People had already parked their cars, bought their drinks, found their seats, and that's when they found out the player they came to watch wasn't playing. Think about what that actually means for a fan who drove 3 hours to be there, or flew in from another state, or brought their kid for the first time specifically because they wanted them to see Caitlin Clark play. You don't find that out when you buy the ticket. You don't find that out when you're still at home and can make a different decision. You find it out once you're already inside the building and the money is already spent. That's not an accident. That's an organization choosing its own convenience over the basic respect of the people who fund its existence. The Fever won that night. Final score 90-73. Clark wasn't on the floor and they still got the W, which maybe made the front office feel like the whole thing had blown over quietly. But 2 days later, she walked out and dropped 22 points in a win over Golden State. Healthy enough to score 22 on a Friday, a mystery on a Tuesday. That gap, that 2-day window between being too hurt to play and being good enough to drop 22 is exactly what Agnes tried to explain, and trying to explain it is what got him erased. So what did he actually write? Because before you can understand why the Fever reacted the way they did, you need to understand what the report said, what it didn't say, and why their response was so wildly disproportionate to anything a fair reading of that piece could justify. Agnes reported from a trusted league source that sitting Clark was part of what that source described as a strategic management plan, a deliberate, careful, precautionary approach designed to protect a body that had already been through serious damage. That's the phrase that set everything off. Strategic management plan. 4 words. And the reason those 4 words mattered so much to the front office is because they implied something the team hadn't officially acknowledged, that this wasn't just a random back twinge, that there was a plan, that someone had made a decision about how to handle Clark's workload, and that decision involved keeping her off the floor on a Tuesday night without telling anyone why. But here's the thing people keep glossing over. Agnes didn't just run with the source and leave it at that. When Coach Christy Side spoke before the game, he went back and updated his story to include her comments. She said Clark was healthy, that this wasn't load management, that it was just a back issue. And Agnes put both accounts in the same piece, his source's version and the coach's version, side by side, clearly labeled, letting the reader weigh them against each other. That is not irresponsible journalism. That is exactly what responsible journalism looks like. You get a tip, you seek the official response, you present both, and you let the audience decide. And then Clark herself, a little later, confirmed that she had fully planned to play that night until back discomfort the day before made that impossible. Her own words lined up almost exactly with what the source had told Agnes. She wasn't hiding anything. She wasn't contradicting the report. She was essentially corroborating the cautious approach he'd described, in her own language, on her own terms. The team's problem was never that Agnes got it wrong. Their problem was that he got it right, and he said it out loud using words they hadn't approved.
Before it ever went public, Fever PR pulled Agnes aside. They told him the tweet was false. They told him it needed to come down. He said no. He had a source he trusted. He had the coach's response already incorporated into the piece, and he wasn't going to retract something accurate just to make the front office feel more comfortable. That moment, that refusal, is where the credential decision was born. Not in any newsroom review or ethics committee. In the back of an arena, when a reporter told the PR staff he wasn't going to lie for them. Here's the piece of this story that the Fever really, genuinely does not want you paying attention to, because everything else you could argue about. You could say Agnes should have waited longer. You could say the phrase strategic management plan was inflammatory. You could construct some version of a defense for the organization if you wanted to. But this part, there is no defense for this part. The WNBA, the league office itself, warned the Indiana Fever about their injury reporting. Not a fan account, not a beat reporter making noise, the league. After the Portland game, after the front office had already demonstrated a pattern of vague and late injury disclosures, the WNBA stepped in and put them on notice. You are not filing these reports correctly. You are not giving appropriate advance notice about your players' availability. Fix it. And the moment that warning landed, something changed. Caitlin Clark's name started appearing on injury reports as probable. The behavior shifted immediately, almost overnight. They went from complete silence to listed as probable within the same news cycle that the league's warning became known. They changed the behavior the second they got caught doing it wrong. Read that twice and let it settle, because what it means is that Scott Agnes filing his report on the night of May 20th wasn't ahead of the story in some reckless or irresponsible way. He wasn't speculating wildly. He was describing something real that the league itself identified as a problem and forced the team to address. He just said it first. He said it out loud before the league's warning became public, which made him inconvenient. And inconvenient in the Indiana Fever world apparently means expendable. Think about the actual rule for a second. The rule says you file the injury report by 5 o'clock. Clark's name wasn't on that report. Not as doubtful, not as questionable, not as probable, not listed at all. And then 90 minutes before tip, she's out. The rule the Fever broke existed before Agnes ever opened his laptop that night. The problem that got him punished was a problem the team created, and the league confirmed, and Agnes simply reported. The warning was never really about his words, it was about their silence and the exposure of it. Cast your mind back, because this isn't the first time we've been here. 2025, 13 games. That's all the Indiana Fever's franchise player gave the floor across an entire season. 13. Out of the possible games she could have appeared in, she was healthy enough to compete in 13. The rest of the season was consumed by a quad strain, a groin injury, and a bone bruise in her left ankle. 3 separate injuries across one season, and throughout all of it, the updates fans received were so vague, so carefully worded and strategically incomplete that it was genuinely difficult at any given point to know whether Clark was actively hurt or whether the team was making decisions about her availability that they simply didn't want to explain. That's the part that tends to get lost in the conversation about player health. It's completely normal for athletes to get hurt. Basketball is physical, the schedule is brutal, and even the most durable players go down at some point. Nobody is expecting a franchise to prevent injuries from happening. What fans are reasonably expecting is to be told the truth about those injuries in something approaching real time. Instead, last season, they got fragments, partial statements, updates that raised more questions than they answered. And because the people asking the follow-up questions were the media, and the media needed credentials to keep asking them, there was always a built-in mechanism to keep the conversation from going too far. Roll into this season, and the fog doesn't lift, it just shifts shapes. Monique Billings sits out a game with an ankle. Aaliyah Boston misses time with a lower leg issue. Clark is out with the back. 3 players, 3 separate nights, and 3 equally blurry pictures of what was actually happening. The Fever didn't invent the concept of being vague about injuries. Every team in every league does some version of this. But when you're running the most talked about franchise in women's basketball, when your star player is the reason casual fans tuned in for the first time, when those fans paid real money and made real travel plans around her availability, the vagueness stops being a strategic decision and starts being a disrespect.
The injuries themselves are not the scandal. They never were. Players get hurt, bodies give out. That's basketball. The scandal is how carefully and consistently the people with actual information have chosen to keep it from the people who paid to be there. That's what Agnes kept pressing on, and that's the thread the organization decided to cut. Now, we need to talk about who actually made this call, because the Fever's official statement is built to keep that question from being answered cleanly. The public-facing version of events says that Fever Public Relations revoked the credential. Fever PR, that's the entity that gets named. That faceless, title-bearing phrase is specifically designed to diffuse accountability. Fever PR is not a person. It's not an individual who has to stand up in front of a camera and explain their reasoning. It's a department, and departments can absorb criticism in a way that individuals cannot. So let's put the actual name on it. Herb Simon. He owns Pacers Sports and Entertainment, the company that operates both the Indiana Pacers and the Indiana Fever under the same corporate roof. The decisions made about who gets access to these franchises and who doesn't, those decisions do not happen in a vacuum below the ownership level on a matter this significant. A 12-year beat reporter doesn't lose his credential over a single story because a PR staffer had a bad week. That kind of decision gets sanctioned from the top, or it doesn't happen. And here's why that matters beyond just this one incident. This is not the first time Herb Simon's organization has shut the door on Scott Agnes. Go back to 2024. Agnes lost his Pacers credential over what was described as a parking dispute, a dispute he flatly denies ever happened the way it was characterized. He was dressed down in front of other members of the media, which is a humiliation tactic, a message sent not just to him, but to everyone watching. He was then barred from the 2026 All-Star Game, which was held right there in Indianapolis, his city, covering his franchise, and he was ruled ineligible for the draft lottery. Same reporter, same ownership group, 3 separate doors slammed in his face over 2 years. There's a word for that pattern. It's not coincidence. It's not a series of unrelated administrative decisions made by different people for different reasons. It's a house style, a way of operating, an organizational philosophy that says when journalists become inconvenient, you remove their ability to report. And the deed to the house has exactly one name on it. The fans caught it. Before the think pieces were written, before the national sports media weighed in, before USA Today's Christine Brennan said out loud that banning your longest-serving beat reporter is never the right thing to do, the fans had already figured out what was happening. The comment sections were ahead of the press releases. One viewer wrote that firing him only proves the cover-up. Another said, the part the organization is praying nobody says out loud is that now he's got nothing left to protect, so let him talk. And that instinct, that crowd-sourced read on the situation is worth taking seriously, because it gets at the thing the Fever's decision-makers apparently didn't think through. When you strip a 12-year insider of his credential, you don't silence him, you free him. You remove the professional obligation to be careful, to be balanced, to protect the access he needs to keep doing his job. You take away the leash, and then you hope he has nothing worth saying, which, based on how hard they worked to keep him quiet, does not seem to be the case. There's a thing that happens in situations like this that PR departments never seem to learn. The cover-up doesn't stay buried, it becomes the story. The moment the Fever made the decision to revoke that credential, they guaranteed that this situation would receive more attention than the original injury report ever would have gotten on its own. Agnes's post about the ban crossed 200,000 views in a single afternoon. Every outlet in women's sports picked it up.
Sports media nationally ran with it. The story went from a niche WNBA beat item to a national conversation about press freedom, organizational transparency, and the lengths a franchise will go in order to control its own narrative. They tried to make one man vanish and instead handed him the loudest week of his professional career. The post-ban coverage was bigger than anything he'd written about the Fever in years, and every click on that story was a fan or a reader asking the exact question the organization wanted nobody to ask. What are they hiding?
Now think about the reporters who are still in that building, the ones who still have their credentials, the ones who watched a 12-year veteran, a man who attended every training camp, who paid for his own photographer, who had readers in 83 countries, who did everything right by every journalistic standard, watched that man lose his access for accurate reporting on Caitlin Clark's health, and ask yourself what lesson they took from that. The answer is obvious. You don't push. You don't ask follow-up questions about injury reports that feel incomplete. You don't take a tip from a trusted source and go find out if it's true. You file the quotes you're given, you write the story you're handed, and you protect the credential that lets you keep your job. Because now they've all seen what happens to the one who doesn't. He's on the outside looking in, and the organization that used his coverage for 12 years of positive attention is done with him. The credential is the leash. That's not a metaphor, that's the mechanism. Media access in professional sports is not a right, it's a privilege that organizations grant and revoke at will. And when an ownership group decides to use that privilege as a control tool, as a way of shaping what gets reported and what doesn't, the effect on coverage is immediate and chilling. The reporters who stay are the ones who understood the message, and the message was explicit. You can ask questions, but only the ones we've already decided we're comfortable answering. So the next time Caitlin Clark's name disappears off an injury report 90 minutes before tip, who asks? The next time a starter is mysteriously unavailable after being listed fine at the 5 o'clock deadline, who pushes? The next time a player is sitting on the bench with a heating pad and the official word is everything's fine, who follows up? Because the person who might have before is standing outside the building now. And the ones still inside learned their lesson the moment the credential was pulled. What fans are left with is whatever version of Caitlin Clark the front office decides is safe to release. Not the truth, not a balanced account with the source's version and the coach's version side by side. The official version, the approved version, the version that protects the brand and keeps the front office comfortable. That's not coverage, that's a press release with a logo on it. And the people who drove 3 hours, who flew in from another state, who brought their kid for the first time, they deserve better than a press release. There's one more layer to this, and it's the one that the Fever's decision-makers probably didn't fully calculate when they made the call. Agnes spent 12 years building a relationship with this organization, attending practices, learning the players, understanding the front office culture, building sources throughout the league who trusted him with information because he demonstrated over more than a decade that he handled it responsibly. All of that institutional knowledge, all of those relationships, all of that understanding of how this franchise operates behind the scenes, the Fever just told him they don't want it anymore. Which means he owes them nothing, not loyalty, not restraint, not the careful professional calculation of what to say and what to hold back to protect his access. The access is gone. The professional obligation that came with it is gone. Whatever he knows about the Indiana Fever, whatever his 12 years of embedded coverage taught him about how they operate, about how they make decisions, about what happens behind closed doors in that building, he now has no institutional reason to keep any of it close to his chest. The organization is banking on him being quiet, on him being the kind of professional who doesn't burn bridges even when those bridges have already been burned for him.
And maybe he will be. Maybe he'll move on and never write the thing that scares them. But they had to make a choice about whether to trust that he'd stay quiet, and they made that choice by taking the one thing that gave them any leverage over what he said publicly. They took his credential and handed him his freedom in the same moment, and then hoped he wouldn't use it. That's a significant gamble, especially when the thing they apparently didn't want said out loud has already been partially confirmed by the league office itself, especially when the behavior they were hiding had already been flagged as a violation, especially when Clark's own words about that night lined up almost exactly with the story they tried to erase.
Thursday comes. Caitlin Clark walks back into Gainbridge Fieldhouse, national television. The cameras are on her every single possession, tracking every move, every expression, every moment she favors one side or adjusts her posture or presses a hand to her back between plays. The building has 17,000 seats, and every one of them is full, and the front office is sitting somewhere in that building, knowing that the most experienced person in the room when it comes to covering this franchise is not in the press box, where he spent the last 12 years. The injury report will say exactly what it's been warned to say. Probable, where it used to say nothing. Listed, where it used to leave blanks. Technically compliant, carefully worded, revealing as little as possible while satisfying the letter of the league's requirements. Because that's what you do when you've already been warned once. You learn the minimum standard and you meet it precisely, without going one syllable further than you have to. And somewhere out there is a 12-year reporter who spent a decade and more of his professional life covering this organization with integrity, who paid for his own photographers, who updated his stories with official responses even when the official responses contradicted his sources, who refused to retract an accurate report just because it made the front office uncomfortable. That man now owes this organization nothing at all. So here's what the Indiana Fever has actually accomplished. They flagged themselves. You don't move this hard, this fast, with this much institutional force to bury a story you're not afraid of. You don't yank the credential of your longest-serving beat reporter over a story that wasn't damaging, unless the damage was in what the story pointed toward. The fear is the confession. The aggression of the response tells you more about what they were trying to hide than the story itself ever could have. They tried to contain it. Instead, they amplified it. They tried to punish a single reporter. Instead, they created a national conversation about what the Indiana Fever doesn't want you to know about Caitlin Clark's health. They tried to send a message to the press corps about the cost of asking inconvenient questions. Instead, they guaranteed that the next inconvenient question gets asked by someone with nothing left to lose. Here's the only question that actually matters now. They erased the man who told you the truth about Caitlin Clark's body. So the next time something happens in that building, the next time a name disappears off a report, or a player sits with a heating pad between runs, or an injury update arrives 90 minutes too late, who tells you the truth then?